It's the Bits and Pieces podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Bits and Pieces podcast for May 2024. I'm Fiona. I'm here with my indie podcaster colleague James. Not much happening this month.
Yep, real quiet one.
We had Humza resigning. We had the Bute House Agreement coming to an end. We had a leadership. Well, it wasn't an election in the end.
Just transfer, really.
We had a general election announcement. So that's what we're going to cover in this month's podcast, plus a few little other bits and pieces that occur to us along the way. Also, we've got a lot coming up in June. So right at the end, I'll give you just a forward look of the podcasts that are coming up in June, because we've got lots of big plans.
You're listening to Bits and Pieces.
When we left the podcast last time, the day we recorded it, that was the day that we had heard that the Bute House Agreement was over, wasn't it? But at that point, we thought it was the Greens who had called an end to it, because they were the ones who'd been wanting to have a membership consultation over the dropping of climate targets. And our conversation last month was, who on earth is going to vote for the Greens if they voluntarily walk away from power in this way? And that was our speculation. But it then became clear it wasn't the Greens who had called an end to the agreement, it was Humza Yousaf. It was obvious that this was quite a shock for the Greens, I suppose losing their ministerial posts unexpectedly. And Patrick asked a question at First Minister's Questions, which I think just summed up how they were feeling. So should we start there?
Let's.
So here's Patrick Harvey at First Minister's Question Time, which happened about 2 hours after the agreement had been terminated.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Who does the First Minister think he is pleased most today? Is it Douglas Ross, Fergus Ewing or Alex Salmond? And more to the point, which of them does he think he can rely on for a majority in Parliament now? First Minister.
Presiding Officer, obviously Patrick Harvey and I spoke this morning, and I go back to the points and the comments that I made this morning. I do thank Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater for their contribution to this government, to their contribution to this country, and I think we can parties take great pride in what the Bute House Agreement has achieved in almost 3 years. It is time for the SNP to govern as a minority government, to reach out on an issue-by-issue basis to other political parties right across this chamber in the best interest of this country. And I believe that there are many issues that unite us, and one of those issues that unite, for example, the SNP and the Green Party, one that we will never demur from in any way, shape or form, is that we think all decisions about Scotland are best made by the people of Scotland.
You want to say anything about any of that?
It wasn't surprising as much as it just was disappointing.
Yes, I was disappointed. I liked the fact they were working together, but I think there were voices in the SNP who were unhappy with the agreement. But anyway, that's what happened. So Humza seemed to be almost brushing off Patrick's concerns there, as if it could just carry on as normal and working together. But within a couple of days, after 2 different votes of no confidence had been called, suddenly Humza had a different view of things.
My hope was to continue working with the Greens in a less formal arrangement as the SNP moved into a new phase of minority government. Unfortunately, in ending the Bute House Agreement in the manner that I did, I clearly underestimated the level of hurt and upset that caused Green colleagues. For a minority government to be able to govern effectively and efficiently, trust when working with the opposition is clearly fundamental. And while a route through this week's motion of no confidence was absolutely possible, I am not willing to trade my values and principles or do deals with whomever simply for retaining power. Therefore, after spending the weekend reflecting on what is best for my party, for the government and for the country I lead, I've concluded that repairing our relationship across the political divide can only be done with someone else at the helm. I have therefore informed the SNP's National Secretary of my intention to stand down as party leader and ask that she commences a leadership contest for my replacement as soon as possible.
So did that surprise you?
Not as much as you might think. It was the sort of traditional political falling on the sword thing that you normally see, especially when a decision has been made that they're thinking, oh yeah, this is going to go down gangbusters, and then it turns out to be a massive debacle. They go,
well, and he was taking full personal responsibility there. I mean, there's lots of theories floating around, very unprovable things, like, oh, something was about to come out that meant he needed an exit route, and this was a convenient way of doing it. It was all constructed to let him leave with dignity. I haven't seen any evidence for that. The other thing that did surprise me, though, was that the one thing that Humza has been very good at, I think, is that sort of relationship building. And the reason we've had no strikes in Scotland in the various services, I think he is good at dealing with people in a consensual, sort of inclusive way. That's certainly the impression he gives. So how he managed to get it so wrong with Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater that morning, it's a mystery to me how he thought he could carry on working with them, having stripped them both of their ministerial roles with no notice when they're halfway through a very challenging agenda of things. It's just very strange. But a bit later, Lorna Slater commented on the votes of no confidence that were on the go. And I thought she was much more diplomatic. She'd obviously had time to regroup her thoughts.
The SNP are still the largest party in Holyrood. They have the right to to try to form a government. So it is now with the SNP to find a leader, to select a new leader, whatever party process is necessary for them. For myself, I think stable governance in Scotland is better for the people of Scotland. So I wish the SNP luck with their process that they have to go through, and we would very much hope to continue to work on some of the good stuff that we've got in the pipeline, things like rent controls, protection for tenants, a new national park. It would be good to be able to continue to work on these things.
So when it comes to the votes of no confidence, the first one put forward by Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, was a vote of no confidence in Humza Yousaf himself as First Minister. Last week, you and Patrick Harvey indicated that you would vote against Humza Yousaf in that. It's likely that Douglas Ross will continue and push forward with that vote anyway. What will you do going forwards? Will you still vote against the First Minister as he, essentially leaves office?
I mean, there's no point in bringing that vote anymore. It has already achieved, I guess, the threat of it has achieved the outcome of getting Humza Yousaf to resign as First Minister. So for them to bring that vote in any case would be pretty petty.
And pretty petty, of course, is one of Douglas Ross's main strengths, as well as opportunistic little git.
Allegedly.
He obviously was just absolutely loving having the opportunity to call a vote of no confidence in Humza. And really, it was nothing to do with the Scottish Tories, whether the Greens and the SNP worked together in government or not. Pure opportunism. And then Labour jumped on the bandwagon with their vote of no confidence against the Scottish government rather than just Humza. And both of them then started piling on pressure that there should be an election rather than just pick another leader, which is a bit rich when the Labour Party in Wales have just appointed a replacement for Mark Drakeford without an election, and the Tories are on to their fourth Prime Minister without an election. So it's just any opportunity they can to take a dig, really. And speaking of taking a dig, Ash Regan couldn't resist taking a bit of a swipe at the Greens.
What is the point of the First Minister dramatically chucking the Greens out of the front door, only for the next one to sneak them in round the back?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, this government will get on with governing as a minority government, and of course in doing so we will reach out to those who share our progressive values, who want to work with us in a constructive manner, and that will be the case for the opposition parties across the whole of this Parliament. The question for them is, can they rise to the occasion?
What happened next is the SNP then had to elect a new leader, and there was a period of a few weeks when candidates speculated about whether they would be running. John Swinney put his hat in the ring, Kate Forbes did, also someone we've interviewed a few times, Graham McCormack. So while that was rumbling on, there was also things happening in Wales. We had just done an interview with Leanne Wood, former leader of Plaid Cymru. The interview was about the Welsh Constitutional Commission, on which she served as a commissioner. You can find that on our website. In fact, I'll link to it below because it's definitely worth listening to. But it's kind of got a bit overshadowed in everything that's happened. Plaid Cymru were in a cooperation agreement with Welsh Labour, and that agreement came to an end. And what had sparked the ending of that was the new leader, Vaughan Gethins, had accepted a donation from somebody who, I don't know, some disgraced businessman. I'm not sure what the backstory was, but it was a very questionable donation, and they thought that he should give it back, and he refused. And now whether that was also an excuse just to end a cooperation agreement, or whether that was a bigger issue than we could see from up here, I'm not sure. But just a week after having spoken to Leanne about the benefits of that agreement, that one's gone as well. I'm just going to play a couple of the clips from that podcast because I think that on the whole constitutional question, there's certainly some things that we could learn from the way the Welsh went about it. So here is Leanne Wood just talking about the process that they followed.
It was remarkable how there was a real genuine attempt, I think, to speak to as many people throughout Wales as we possibly could. And I think there were over 10,000 people who engaged with the Commission at some point over the course of the 2 years.
Really?
Yeah, and we could have spoken to more. We could have done so much more in terms of that public engagement, but it was a genuine attempt to have a national conversation, and various different methods were used in order to do that. There were citizens' panels, there were online surveys, there were public meetings, there were art projects which enabled people to express themselves through the medium of murals. There were all kinds of different innovative ways of trying to get people talking about what it is they wanted to have as their constitutional future. And of course, people tend not to talk about the Constitution in constitutional terms. It's all about the bread and butter issues, isn't it? How will these powers affect my life? Who is making the decision? How can I influence that decision? So, it enabled us to open up and explore the debate about the kind of Wales we want to live in. And so it was a really interesting experience. It was a humbling experience because you could see people going along a journey, and they, many people started telling us they didn't understand the constitutional settlement. They didn't understand where decisions were taken. But of course, some of these processes provided information and took people along a learning journey. And the positions they started out with in some of these citizens' panels ended up being different to the positions that they ended up with. So the more information that people had, the more actually, in many cases, they were going along the journey of independence, which I found very, very interesting.
I really enjoyed that conversation we had with Leanne, and one of the things that particularly impressed me was that's a grown-up discussion with people about their constitutional future. It's not squabbling and hurling insults and making votes of no confidence just because you can and taking sideswipes at your colleagues. It just seemed to be a more quality, more genuine kind of conversation. We took the opportunity to pick Leanne's brains on this. But I'm just really quite attracted to the idea of an actual commission. And if we set it up now, we'd have a report by 2026, which is when the Holyrood elections are.
Could you combine the two and turn a constitutional convention into a report like the one that we produced?
I think we could. I mean, setting up that sort of constitutional convention, which, would be politicians of any independent sporting party, but also Civic Scotland as well. I mean, that was put forward to the SNP conference end of last year, and it was accepted. So what would trigger it is SNP having a majority of seats in Westminster after this general election. That would trigger that happening. And the sooner it's in place, the better.
If you could encourage whoever is behind setting up this convention after the election, when the SNP get a majority of seats, direct them to our commission report, because it sets out there how we engaged with people, so you could follow that process and engage with people in the same way. You could engage with more people and have them all inputting into something that you can produce at the end of the process. Otherwise, you're right. I mean, lots of people are able to let off steam, perhaps, but you've got nothing to show for it at the end in terms of a body of evidence. So you might as well incorporate that as part of the work, I would say, because then you've got something useful at the end.
Now, obviously, with an election coming up in the next 6 weeks, nobody's going to be thinking as far ahead as the Constitutional Convention. But Marlene was right there when she said the SNP getting a majority of seats was the trigger for the Constitutional Convention. So the question, I think, for us is, so what if they don't get a majority of seats? Does that mean it doesn't happen? Or does it happen? In which case, who makes it happen? It would be a real shame if we lost sight of that Constitutional Convention just because of a Westminster parliamentary result that might not be as good as we'd like it to be. Because as Leanne was saying there, the process of having that discussion was in itself something that helped people change their mind.
Definitely the best way for people to arrive at a different conclusion as well, isn't it? That they arrive at that conclusion themselves after being informed. Because people are making uninformed decisions. People are being asked to make choices without information all the time. And Brexit is a classic example of that, isn't it?
And interesting that Leanne should mention Brexit there, because Mark Carney, who, as you'll remember, was the governor of the Bank of England during the Brexit process, was speaking at a conference in Canada. And this is what he remembers.
Some right-wing populists that see current anxieties as an opportunity to stoke anger because anger is what's necessary for their project. After all, people don't demolish things when they're positive or optimistic. I know this from my time in the UK, where for years the rallying cry of Brexiters was broken Britain. And their solution to take back control was actually code for tear down your future. So while Brexiters promised that they were going to create Singapore on the Thames, the Truss government actually delivered Argentina on the Channel. Broken Britain. Does that sound familiar? When politicians claim our great democracies are broken, it's not because they want to fix them. It's because they want a license to demolish. And it's a model that's been used time and time again. Create an external constraint to starve the beast of government in a misguided view that slashing will lead to growing.
You're listening to Bits and Pieces.
So that first section was kind of scene setting, wasn't it? We then moved into the leadership question for the SNP, and John Swinney was the first person to make a leadership bid.
Looking across these islands, with a UK election looming, the SNP alone stands up for ordinary people, for workers, for families. The Tories are targeting the weakest and blaming the vulnerable for the disaster they have made of the UK economy. They seek to divide, to blame, to polarise. And Labour disappoint with policy after policy dumped in the empty pursuit of power. Only the SNP stand where the majority of people want their government to be, in the moderate centre-left of Scottish politics. That is where I stand. And if elected by my party and by Parliament, my goals as First Minister will come straight from that centre-left tradition, the pursuit of economic growth and social justice. Economic growth not for its own sake, but to support the services and the society we all want to see. I will pursue priorities that will make Scotland the best our country can be as a modern, innovative, dynamic nation.
So would that get your vote if you had been an SNP member?
Well, at least he was true to character. Aspirationally being moderately centre-left.
Yeah. The phrase I heard most associated with his application was a safe pair of hands. Now, a safe pair of hands could be quite useful if you're in a difficult situation. It's perhaps not very inspirational, but the SNP are in trouble right now. You can see that from the polls.
Yeah, I think that's your issue is it's very comforting to know that the machine will keep chugging along and you'll probably not see too many hiccups along the way and you go, good, yes, it is in safe hands. But yeah, the minute you need something exciting to set people up to go, wow, that's aspirational. Ooh, look, that looks like something interesting on the horizon. That's when that approach starts to fall apart and you sort of see people going, oh, well, I guess it'll just be a bit more of the same. Oh, well, fantastic.
Although, to be fair, in the context of when this was taking place, there was still no indication there was going to be an election called 2 weeks later. So a safe pair of hands to steer the party through after a period of uncertainty would have sounded quite attractive, I think.
For sure. And now it'll be interesting to see how they transition that into, okay, well, now the big moment is coming. How are we going to ramp this up?
So John Swinney put forward his leadership bid. Kate Forbes was thinking about whether she would have another go at the leadership. But then John and Kate got together, had a chat. Kate decided she wasn't going to stand. And it was clear that John Swinney had offered her something better.
If elected, I will bring together the strengths and abilities of all of our people in a cohesive, inclusive team, including our councillors throughout Scotland, our members of Parliament in Westminster, and our members of the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood. We have many talented people leading the work of the Scottish Government. I want Kate Forbes to play a significant part in that team. She is an intelligent, creative, thoughtful person who has much to contribute to our national life. And if elected, I will make sure that Kate is able to make that contribution. And that will be part of a united team that draws together our whole party, which, given my deep devotion to the SNP, I think I am best placed to put together.
He actually made Kate Deputy First Minister and also gave her a role in charge of the economy. Huge, big job. I think that's almost a masterstroke, actually. And I remember thinking at the time that Humza was first elected, he and Kate were quite close in terms of votes. If he had made Kate his deputy at that point, that would have done a lot to heal what were quite big fractures. Particularly Kate actually had a real go at him in the leadership contest and came up with lines that are still being used by the opposition to attack the SNP to this day. Having been elected then, the first thing he did, his acceptance speech, after he'd made that, he went over and he shook hands with each of the party leaders at Holyrood. I don't think any other leader has done that. Certainly I don't remember them doing it. And I thought that was a very nice touch. And he was talking about consensual politics and doing politics differently. I think within a day or two of that, in what I thought was a brilliant move, he took down Douglas Lumsden, who is a nasty piece of work at the best of times.
Presiding officer, the extremist Greens have been ditched from government, so can the First Minister tell me if the damaging policy of presumption against new oil and gas will also be ditched?
First Minister.
I don't think Mr Lumsden's language is appropriate in Parliament. Now, it's not for me to police that. I'm just giving my observation about that. That's a matter for the presiding officer. But I think in the spirit of trying to get us to a position where we all respect each other's opinion, I disagree with Mr Lumsden fundamentally on more issues than I care to imagine. But he will be treated with courtesy by me. And I think others should be treated with courtesy in this chamber as well. So the government, and please, President Officer, allow me to say that I was not intruding on your responsibilities either, but I just generally think the public expect us to be quite civilised to each other, and it would be nice if we could be. On the question, the substantive point of the question, I want to make sure that we have a just transition for the oil and gas sector. We have a climate crisis with us. We have to take careful and appropriate steps to respond to that climate crisis, and that must involve a just transition for the oil and gas sector, and that's what the government will deliver.
I was really pleased he pulled him up for that, because there's a couple of them in the Scottish Tories, in fact, probably about half a dozen of them, that do speak in that kind of language. You know, the extremist Greens, the disgraced SNP, they attach a nasty adjective to whatever they're saying just to get digging. I think that the presiding officer should have been pulling them up whenever they do that. It doesn't add to the point they're making, it just ratchets up the atmosphere to one of hostility.
I think it'll be nice if it sets a new standard, which is actually something that you could maybe answer for me now. Have you seen the presiding officer now take a different tack, maybe adapt from this point onwards, or has things largely continued in the same way?
I can't say I've noticed the presiding officer doing anything any different. Have Tories been any better behaved? Maybe not. But, the line in the sand has been drawn.
Certainly, and if he can maintain that standard throughout his tenure, then that will be seen as a positive.
And he is quite a dignified, measured person. I think this is where the safe pair of hands comes in. Having said that, it is a bit of a risky line because all he has to do is lose his concentration once and say something rude or snap back, and he can do that. I have heard him do that in the past. And, he loses the moral high ground. But for now, I think he does have the moral high ground. Staying with John and is setting the scene in the first few months, he was asked a question in an interview about...
Can independence be delivered within 5 years?
I think independence can be delivered in that timescale because the arguments for it are compelling. If we look at two of the biggest issues we face as a country in Scotland, the effect of the cost of living and the implications of Brexit, both of those major strategic factors that are doing severe economic and social damage to Scotland are because of bad decisions taken in Westminster, and independence is the answer to that. But I acknowledge that we have got work to do to build greater support for independence, to make that support level compelling within Scotland, and that's what my leadership will all be about.
At least it's positive that he's saying it can be done within 5 years. He and others repeatedly make the point, and it's true, that they have to persuade more people. What I'm not seeing, though, is, and here is the plan to do it. We've got 2 years till the Holyrood election. What are you going to do in that 2 years? Or are you just going to vaguely hope that people will change their mind by some kind of osmosis?
Yeah, it's tough. There never really has been a formal plan for these things. There's been a lot of policy work done, obviously, but...
See, again, this is where policy papers, they're there to refer to, but they don't actually change anybody's minds, which comes back to what Leanne was saying, what the Constitutional Commission in Wales did. By drawing people into the conversation, in that conversation, they convince themselves just by getting access to facts and calm discussion. Again, it brings us back to this constitutional convention that the SNP are saying will come about, but only if they win a majority of seats. Well, what if they don't win a majority of seats? It's all very if at the moment, I think.
True, but it is important also to remember that you can't peg everything on just whichever party is in power. This is where you start to really get into the whole, what is grassroots? Can you in fact get the people who just want the thing to do the thing themselves? And it needs to be on a community by community basis. It needs to be like almost a big distributed network of various nodes in various places feeding in towards this one central thing that will eventually become a convention.
Well, that is an interesting thought. And you're right, it doesn't have to be driven by government. And in fact, the grassroots movement, the independence movement itself, if we could just stop all the warring factions being warring factions and get together and agree a route way, somebody needs to come up with that 2-year plan, because we know when the end spot is, we know where we need to be, what are the actions that are going to get us there, and that's just a piece of straightforward strategizing and planning and research, I think. And just before we leave this section, the last clue we got to John's style as First Minister was in response to that disgraceful Secretary of State against Scotland, Alistair Jack Bute, who in a Westminster committee casually mentioned that he fully expects there to be unionists in power in Holyrood very soon, and as soon as they get there, he's going to put nuclear power plants in Scotland. Now, the fact that Scotland produces more than its own requirement for electricity out of renewables already, never mind having to wait 10 years and pay a lot of money to build something new that'll only come up with a gigawatt of power anyway, Scotland is also producing a quarter of the renewable energy that's powering England. So if England wants to put a nuclear power station in to increase their own capacity, fine. But how dare he suggest that we can just stick it in Scotland? We don't want it.
Well, what about that sweet, sweet surplus profit?
well, it's sweet, sweet poisonous 14,000-year half-life of the nuclear waste. Whose problem would that be? Ours. Anyway, this was John Swinney's response to that suggestion.
Presiding Officer, I'm often lectured in this Parliament about the importance of good intergovernmental relations. The Secretary of State for Scotland has made no mention of this proposal to the Scottish Government. This is utterly and completely incompatible with good intergovernmental working, and is illustrative of the damaging behaviour, the menacing behaviour of the Secretary of State for Scotland. The Scottish Government will not support new nuclear power stations in Scotland. I was in Ardezir on Monday. The Net Zero Secretary was in Nig on Tuesday, supporting the announcements of formidable investments in the renewable energy potential of Scotland. Massive investments that will bring jobs and opportunities to the Highlands and Islands and deliver green, clean energy for the people of Scotland. That's the policy agenda of this government, and we'll have nothing to do with nuclear power.
You're listening to Bits and Pieces.
Just as we were all getting used to the idea of having a new First Minister, Rishi Sunak left his umbrella in the hallway, ventured out into the rain and called a general election. This is how Marlene and I heard the news.
I was quite taken aback. I've been watching the BBC Paula Vennell's post office thing, and suddenly they were talking about an announcement from Number 10. Now, I know that Fiona doesn't watch BBC, but I'm still paying the licence, so I do. And I'm kind of typing, I think it's going to be an announcement. They're saying it's going to be about the election, and a bit of me went, oh, I hope not. Oh, no, if it's going to be that quick. And then it all happened, didn't it? Gosh, just 6 weeks.
I thought it was actually going to happen in May on the grounds that he'd said it was going to be October. So I knew that the one day it wasn't going to be was October.
Well, I suppose, that's right. The more cynical we are, the more dates you could kind of gradually. I may have reached election fatigue very, very quickly. But
it was about 20 minutes after the announcement.
About 20 minutes. God, the poor bloke, he was soaked, wasn't he? It was pouring down. And then there was music. Did you hear that later on?
No, I've not seen it.
Well, this time, suddenly, there's all this music, and I'm going, I sort of vaguely thought I recognised the music, but later on I heard someone saying it was the music that the Labour Party used in the run-up to the 1997 election.
Oh, was that Things Can Only Get Better?
Things Can Only Get Better, and it was...
Because I was just finding out about it as you posted, because I don't have BBC. There was a point where you said, Sunak's really wet. And I thought, yeah, he is a bit wet. And then I saw a picture and it was actually pouring.
It was pouring. It was pouring. To be honest, my first response was, he must be doing this because he thinks it will get even worse for the Tories if he hangs on. Labour, probably ready to go anyway, but I'm not so sure that that's the case for us in Scotland. I mean, I was sort of remembering about, 2017 in a way, at least SNP got a bit, they weren't quite ready for that election being called. And I'm wondering if that might not be the same.
So that was me and Marlene just absorbing the news as it happened. And if you want to hear the whole episode of that, it's on our YouTube channel and on our wherever you get your podcasts. We will be doing regular little campaign updates, bonus podcasts as things happen throughout the next 6 weeks. And we're working on a plan for election night as well, which could be interesting. Stephen Flynn also responded to the news.
Why do you think that Labour are so keen to rule out doing a deal with you guys, but not the Lib Dems?
Well, firstly, Sophie, I did enjoy the discussion you were having with the Labour representative there about how their fiscal rules are different to the Tories, and they couldn't spell out why, because they're both wedded to £18 billion of public sector cuts, which of course will lead to austerity. But when it comes to why the Labour Party won't work or doesn't want to work with the SNP, it's because we would be their conscience. We would say that we want to be in the single market, we would say that we want increased migration, we would say that we want more investment in net zero, and of course we would be against that austerity agenda. But I guess the thing that terrifies them the most about the Scottish National Party is that we believe that the people of Scotland should have a choice over its own future. The Labour Party disagree.
And for various reasons, you've probably seen a lot of the memes on the go about just how awful Sunak's election launch has been, to the extent that people are starting to wonder who has infiltrated his press office. But Anas Sarwar wasn't having it all his own way either. And here's an interesting little juxtaposition of Anas talking about the NHS and Wes Streeting, his Labour colleague, talking about the NHS.
Our NHS faces the biggest crisis in its lifetime. The health boards are being asked to make cuts across the country because of decisions made by John Swinney. So does he accept responsibility, and what is he going to do to fix the mess he made?
Right across the United Kingdom, every part of the NHS is in crisis, and all roads do lead back to Westminster, because even though this is devolved, decisions taken in Westminster have an impact on the NHS across the whole country.
So there you have it. Schrodinger's NHS. In Scotland, it's all John Swinney and the SNP's fault. In Wales, run by Labour, it's all the fault of Westminster. So which is it?
You can't tell, because you observe it would change, hence Schrodinger. Your analogy is slightly off.
But it's quite interesting that the SNP campaigning I've seen have picked up on that. Wes Streeting is just blowing Anas Sarwar's argument out of the water, because the funding does come from Westminster. It's based on the funding that goes into the English NHS. That's how the formula works. And Wes Streeting, remember, is the one who wants to privatise the NHS. Labour, Pat McFadden, talking about Great British Energy. Now, this is Keir Starmer's big offer to the Scottish people. He's going to create GB Energy. Well, there's a problem there for half of Scotland for a start. And he's going to headquarter it in Scotland, which will be a plaque on a wall that they can use as a threat next time we look to be getting above 50% in the polls. But here's Pat McFadden being asked to explain how it's going to work.
Well, what specific Scottish policies will you be offering?
Well, we're going to be speaking a lot about that in the next 6 weeks.
Well, give us an idea. What specifically Scottish?
We gave an indication of the direction of travel when we published the 6 first steps that we published last Thursday, and those were around the economy, GB Energy, for example, which is our new publicly owned energy company.
But none of those specifically Scottish, are they?
Well, GB Energy is actually going to be headquartered.
Yeah, but GB Energy, the very definition is there in the name, that actually this is a policy for the whole of the UK. I'm asking whether there's anything specifically Scottish here.
Well, we'll always respect the devolution settlement, and we'll work hand in hand with our Scottish Labour colleagues on that.
The assumption that Scottish Labour colleagues are going to be the ones running the show by Pat McFadden. But this whole GB Energy, the more that comes out about it, it's clear there is no proper plan. But Anas Sarwar admitted that it's going to be 75% private sector owned. So, again, where's the benefit to us? This next one is Tommy Shepherd in Westminster, again, just explaining the duplicity when they try and talk about responsibility and the limitations of devolution.
The entire thing, of course, that we're talking about here, when we talk about Scottish government borrowing, let us remember that this is borrowing with the permission of the UK Treasury, guaranteed by the UK Treasury. It is not possible for the Scottish Government to go and do a deal with a private sector house builder and get some private finance to try and build more social housing as an additional project in Scotland. It's not possible, because it wouldn't, unless it's agreed to by the UK Treasury and comes within these limits. So the Scottish Government, which is heralded as the most powerful devolved regional government in the world, doesn't even have the financial capital powers that a medium-sized business would have in order to manage its own affairs. And that's why, when the end comes to it, that really what this argument should be about is arguing for a government in Scotland that has got the capacity to make decisions about capital spending and about other aspects of our finances which are based upon the needs and requirements of the people of Scotland rather than the needs and requirements of mandarins in the Treasury in Whitehall. And that is why we should have independence for Scotland.
Yeah. The EU is a key battleground in the election, and as it happens, Hashbury Stumble, who is a legendary supporter of both Independence Live and Scottish Independence podcasts, who we actually met for the first time at the Believe in Scotland March. It was lovely to meet him. Hashbury Stumble has asked one of the questions on the Ian Dale phone-in panel show. We'll play his question and then the answers that the panel gave. I have trimmed all the answers just for length, but this will give you the gist of where they all stand on the EU question.
John's in Glasgow. Hello, John.
Hello, good evening, Ian and panel. I would like to ask if any of the parties represented tonight, if their manifestos will propose that Britain should rejoin the European Union, as seems to be the majority view of the general population.
Richard Thompson for the SNP.
Yes, it will. I mean, I want Scotland to be in the European Union. I very much regret the fact that we were taken out of the European Union against the will of those who cast their votes in Scotland. I'm very clear the best outcome is for all parts of the UK to be back into the European Union. Steve and I have sparred over the situation of Northern Ireland, and I think many of the problems that we've sparred over would not have arisen at all had we stayed at least within the single market and customs union. But I think we have to be realistic. All the other three parties, Labour, Lib Dems, Conservatives, are either have fully embraced it or are at least accepting of the situation that we're in. And I think that voters like yourself have an opportunity in Scotland to vote for something better, to put our future back in their own hands and to go back into the European Union as an independent Scotland.
And why aren't the Liberal Democrats making that case, Alistair Carmichael?
We do make the case. I mean, I think we're realistic in saying that, yes, we want to get there eventually. We'll see what's in the manifesto come the publication of it. You heard Davy recently saying that we would want to go back into the single market as the first step of undoing some of the economic damage that has been done by Brexit. So that would be a sensible first step. And, you know, it's not going to be a quick or an easy process. Your first question was about how do we restore faith in politics? Well, you know, I think repairing some of the damage that was done by messages that were written inside of a bus, or in my constituency, fishermen promised a sea of opportunity and the rest of it, which the reality has turned out to be very, very different, would be a good step.
Annalise Dodds, I suspect that a large proportion of your party membership would like to go back into the EU, but Keir Starmer can't promise any such thing, can he? Because he wouldn't win back some of the red wall seats that he needs to.
Well, the reality is, of course, that people have voted to leave the EU. That decision has been taken. Now, I'm someone who was on the different side of the argument during the referendum. I was campaigning for the UK to stay within the EU, but ultimately, it's very clear in that referendum that wasn't what people wanted. And of course, Labour ran at the last general election saying that we would have another referendum, and we lost that election. That decision has been taken by the British people.
Tony Blair always said that he rather regrets the fact that he wasn't more radical in his first term. He had this massive majority and frankly could have got away with anything if he'd wanted to. And he now thinks he made a mistake by that. Now, everyone's speculating about the size of a Labour majority, but let's say it was a massive majority. Surely that almost would give Keir Starmer the mandate to go much further than you're intimating that he would. I mean, just renegotiating things here and there on veterinary agreements, whatever. It's pretty small beer compared to what some people say the damage is that Brexit's done.
Of course, not a single vote has yet been cast in the general election, so we need to see what the outcome of it will be.
OK, Steve.
Well, the privilege of convening and organising the Conservative Eurosceptic MPs since 2015 has been a mixed blessing. But one of the positive blessings is, well, indeed, yeah, but because somebody will shout at the radio, but I'm regarded as a straight talker, and I've ended up with very positive relations with EU embassies. I won't name the countries, but, significant countries. And I can tell people a couple of things. One, they wouldn't want us back. It's 8 years on. We've only just got out with the Windsor framework, and they would not want us back.
They're quite an interesting little roundup there. As I say, I've shortened their answers, but that was Steve Baker, the Tory, I think he's the Minister for Northern Ireland or Secretary for Northern Ireland or something. Absolutely up himself in terms of he's got all the answers. But Annalise Dodds from Labour there, bringing out that old line, the British people have made their decision, we can't possibly go back into the EU. Why are they fighting the election then? Because surely the British people also make their decision in 2019. They were going to have a Tory government. Democracy is a process. It's not a single event. Things happen. Ridiculous line for it to take. So that was Annalise Dodds and Alistair Carmichael there, sounding like he certainly hasn't been given early sight of what's in the Lib Dems manifesto. Right, and the final clip in this section, we've majored on the sort of some of the weaknesses of the Labour campaign there, but the bottom line is people do just want to get rid of the Tories from Westminster. And my take on why Sunak's called the election as soon as he has, I think he's just given up. He wants to be in one of his many mansions, probably in California, before the summer's out, and just wants to be out of it. That's my impression anyway. But there is one last little clip. This came from a Westminster committee meeting. I'm not sure who was asking the question. Unfortunately, I missed the name. But they were questioning Sainsbury's board on the level of pay they have. Now, just a statistic that is really quite telling. In the 70s, the average board executives' pay was 20 times that of their employees. In 2024, it's 2,000 times what their employees earn. That is what 14 years of Tory government have done in a nutshell. They have transferred money from poor people, from working people, and they've given it to the top 1%. To add to the pile. As I said, I don't know who it was who asked the question, but it was a really good question, and the members of Sainsbury's board just didn't understand what the problem was.
I'm looking at Sainsbury's annual report and the chief executive, I think that's Mr. Roberts. He's paid almost £4 million in bonuses on top of his salary. And I'd really like to know how you justify that in the midst of a cost of living crisis. I think if you look at Mr. Roberts, that's 4.9 million, £408,000 a month, £94,000 a week, £2,298 an hour, and workers are paid £11 an hour. How is that justifiable when the people who work for you and the people who come at the stores are suffering from a grotesque cost of living crisis now? How can that possibly be justified?
Well, as a listed company, you'll know that all of our board directors' salaries are published. They're set by the REMCO. I don't sit on the REMCO. I don't have any remit over setting any of those salaries, so I can't really comment any further on that today.
Do you not get the point that this discussion is couched around a cost of living crisis, and yet I've got to say the chief executives across the board are in the same ballpark in terms of their pay? Do you not understand how that sits with the general public, that these sorts of wages are being paid, and you tell us that your purpose is to provide the most reasonably priced food for your customers, and yet dividends are paid out and these salaries at this level? Does that not chime with any of you? No. That's just absolutely, utterly staggering, quite frankly.
So, as a working dude...
Wow, I feel respected.
2,000 times what their employees are being paid. So you've got Sainsbury, that was the example that was in that conversation, but the other supermarkets and retail in general is pretty much the same. But you could have two working people in a household who still can't afford to pay their rent. That is just an appalling indictment of Tory Britain. And much as I despair at Labour, and there's such a disappointment, it is still going to be worth seeing the Tories get kicked out in England. I'm really looking forward to that. I really don't want the Labour to be making any headway in Scotland, though, because they have nothing for us, and their policies, even the things they're offering, are either things we've already got, like publicly owned water, nationalised railways, free tuition, or worse, they're promising those things, then rowing back on it, and then they'll have to get rid of ours to save everybody else being feeling hard done by. I don't get the sense there's any great enthusiasm for it out in the streets yet, but we really have got a lot to lose if we let Labour get the upper hand again in Scotland, I think.
It'll be a setback in terms of independence for sure. Although, even that thing that we just played... We get to this a lot at the end of these episodes, but that's not actually a uniquely Tory problem. We reduce this to this all the time. That's just capitalism.
Well, yes, capitalism, yes. What's your catchphrase? Capitalism, baby.
Yeah. That's the thing, you sort of try and look at it and go, oh, well, that... And don't get me wrong, yes, the Tories are a massive proponent of capitalism because they are amongst the group that seeks to get far richer through it.
And Sunak paid 0.5% tax. You, on the minimum wage, paid a lot more than that. Me, as a pensioner, pay more than that. So, you know...
You're listening to Bits and Pieces.
That's the end of the clips that we've got. What I'm going to do now is just run through what's coming up in June, because as I said, it's going to be quite an interesting month. What we plan to do, as you know, new podcast every Friday. The 7th of June, we've got the panel discussion that Edinburgh Yes Hub organised a couple of weeks ago. That has got members Colin Fox for the SSP, it's got Kenny McGaskill from ALPA, it's got Ewan Hislop from SNP, and it's got Alex Martin, who's an independent, but he's standing against Ian Murray in Edinburgh. So that's a really good discussion. That'll be Friday the 7th. Then on the 14th, we are hoping to have Philippa Whitford, who's talking at a Christians for Independence event. Then on the 21st, we've got a discussion with Pat Kane, who was one of the speakers on the Believe in Scotland rally, and has a lot of ideas on what we can do to perhaps get that older demographic, i.e. the one me and Marlene are in, pensioners level, to get more of them or supporting independence. And then the 28th, Friday the 28th, normally the last Friday of the month, is Bits and Pieces, as you know. It will be the last Friday before the election as well, so we may turn the Bits and Pieces into some kind of campaign special. We'll have to see. As well as that, Marlene and I will be at the Bannockburn March on the 22nd of June in Stirling. So if you see us there, come and say hello. It's always lovely to meet our listeners. We are going to be doing more election coverage. In particular, we fancy doing something we're calling Manifesto Madness. So we're going to invite our listeners, if you get something through the door that's making wild claims or it's got some other nonsense on it that you think would be good to highlight on the show, then take a picture of it or scan it and email it to us on indiepodcasters@gmail.com, and we'll try and feature it on the show. That would be lovely. And just finally, you might notice appearing on our website and in these posts that we've added a Buy Me a Coffee option. Now, as you know, Marlene and I are both retired, so we give our time for free, and we'll continue doing that, not least because we love doing these podcasts. And we do get the use of the StreamYard studio from Independence Live, as do several other programmes like Scotonomics and The Locker Room, what have you. And it doesn't actually cost very much to put on a podcast. I mean, the web hosting and the Podbean, which we pay ourselves, we're quite happy to do that. But what we have noticed is that people really seem to enjoy the content we do when we're out and about. So we'd like to actually do a bit more travelling to places, to events and things. So if you've enjoyed what we do, you might like to just buy us a coffee, and we'll put that towards getting out and about and getting even more content for our podcast and our YouTube channel. But only if you can afford it. If you can't, it's absolutely fine. Just share. That's just as useful to us. And if you see our posts or like the podcast or like a YouTube video, if you share it to somebody else, that's really helpful. If you do want to buy us a coffee, I take mine black. Marlene likes a latte. So thanks for listening, everybody. And we'll just see what the next 6 weeks brings. Thanks for your input, James.
Thank you. See you all next time.
Okay, bye now.
You've been listening to Bits and Pieces.